The year was 1847, and Louisiana breathed slowly under the weight of heat, wealth, and unspoken rules. The plantation stood like a small kingdom carved out of endless land, its white columns rising proudly against a sky that often burned gold at sunset. From a distance, it looked serene, almost beautiful, the kind of place travelers described with admiration and envy. Rows of sugarcanes stretched toward the horizon, moving gently when the wind passed through them, as if the land itself were alive and obedient. But that beauty was carefully staged, like a painted backdrop hiding everything ugly behind it. Life here followed a strict rhythm. Bells rang at dawn, shadows grew long by evening, and silence ruled the night except for insects and distant footsteps that never seemed to rest. Inside the main house lived the plantation owner's wife, a woman whose name was spoken softly and always with respect. She wore fine dresses imported from New Orleans, her hair styled neatly, her posture flawless. To visitors, she was the image of Southern grace, a woman who hosted dinners with practiced smiles and poured tea as if she had been born knowing nothing else. Her laughter was polite, measured, and rare. People assumed she was happy because happiness in their world was supposed to come automatically with wealth, marriage, and status. No one asked her what she felt. No one thought to look behind her eyes. Her days began the same way, each morning blending into the next until time itself seemed trapped. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, falling across polished floors and heavy furniture that had been in the family for generations. Servants moved quietly through the halls, careful not to disturb her unless summoned. Breakfast was served at the same hour, the same dishes arranged the same way. Her husband often ate quickly, already distracted by ledgers, shipments, and the endless calculations of profit and control. He spoke of land, of harvests, of discipline, rarely of feelings. When he left the table, the house grew larger and quieter, echoing with the absence of conversation. She spent long hours alone, walking the galleries that overlooked the fields, watching tiny figures move below like shadows against the earth. From above, everything looked orderly, controlled, and distant. The suffering was far enough away that society pretended it didn't exist. She had been taught not to ask questions, not to linger on thoughts that made her uncomfortable. From childhood, she had learned that obedience was a virtue, silence a sign of strength. Marriage, she had been told, was a woman's purpose, and endurance was her reward. Yet inside her, something restless stirred. It wasn't rebellion at first, just a quiet awareness that her life felt sealed shut, like a room with no windows. She had traded one form of confinement for another, first her father's home, then her husband's. Every choice had been made for her long before she understood she might want something else. The dresses, the jewels, the fine china all felt heavy, as if they weighed her down rather than lifted her up. At night, lying beside a man who barely noticed her breathing, she stared into darkness and wondered how a life could feel so empty while looking so full from the outside. The plantation demanded her presence at social gatherings, where other women spoke of children, church events, and new fabrics, their voices blending into a soft hum of sameness. She smiled, nodded, and played her role perfectly. No one noticed how often she drifted away in thought, how her eyes lingered on the horizon just a little too long. To these women, she was fortunate. To them, her life was the reward they all hoped for. Admitting dissatisfaction would have sounded like madness, or worse, ingratitude. Even the house itself seemed to conspire against her. Its high ceilings trapped heat and echoes, amplifying her loneliness. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes watching silently, reminding her of generations who had lived and died within the same rigid expectations. Every corner carried history, and none of it belonged to her. She was merely another figure placed into the frame, expected to behave exactly as those before her had. Outside, the plantation functioned like a machine that never stopped. The sound of work carried faintly through the air, the crack of whips shouted orders, the low murmur of exhaustion. These sounds were not discussed openly inside the house. They were part of the background, like wind or rain, something unpleasant but accepted. She had been taught to look away, to believe that this suffering was necessary, even righteous. But sometimes, when the night was quiet and the walls could not keep out everything, those sounds reached her anyway, slipping into her thoughts and refusing to leave. There were moments when she stood at the window long after sunset, watching torches move in the distance, her chest tightening with a feeling she did not yet have words for. It was not guilt alone, and not pity either. It was the uncomfortable realization that her comfort was built upon pain she was never meant to acknowledge. That knowledge sat heavy in her stomach, unspoken and unresolved. Her husband, proud of his land and his authority, rarely noticed these changes in her. To him, she was part of the estate, another possession that reflected his success. He provided for her materially, and in his mind, that was enough. Emotional distance was not cruelty to him, it was simply the way things were. When he spoke to her, it was often with instruction rather than affection. When he touched her, it felt more like habit than desire. She learned to accept this too, because resistance had no place in her world. As weeks turned into months, her inner world grew richer and more dangerous than her outer one. She began to think more deeply, to observe more closely, to question things she had once accepted without hesitation. The plantation, once merely her home, began to feel like a gilded cage. Every rule, every expectation tightened around her like invisible chains. She wondered what freedom felt like, not in the abstract way people spoke of it, but in the simple sense of choosing one's own path, of belonging to oneself. She did not yet know that her life was approaching a breaking point. At this stage, everything still appeared unchanged to those around her. The plantation stood firm, the routines continued, and her role remained intact. But beneath that calm surface, something fragile was forming. The silence that surrounded her was no longer peaceful, it was charged, waiting. The woman everyone believed they understood was slowly becoming someone else, shaped by loneliness, suppressed longing, and a growing awareness that safety without freedom was its own kind of prison. In 1847 Louisiana, such thoughts were dangerous, especially for a woman like her. The society she lived in did not forgive deviation. It did not allow women to want more than what was given to them. Yet the seed had been planted quietly and invisibly, and once planted it would not remain dormant forever. It began without intention, without a plan, and without a single moment that could later be pointed to as the start. That was the most dangerous part of it all. On the plantation, days unfolded according to habit, and habit had a way of hiding change until it was already too late. She first noticed him not because he stood out physically, but because he did not behave the way the others did. While most moved with eyes lowered and bodies trained into submission, he carried himself with a quiet restraint that felt deliberate. He did not rush when spoken to, nor did he exaggerate obedience to earn favor. There was a calmness in him that did not belong to a man in chains. At first, he was just another presence in the background of her life. She saw him from the gallery above, working near the edge of the fields or repairing fencing closer to the house. Sometimes he was sent on errands that brought him briefly into her line of sight, carrying supplies, delivering messages, standing still while orders were given. Their eyes met only by accident, and when they did, it startled her. There was no fear in his gaze, no pleading. Instead, there was awareness. He looked as if he understood exactly where he stood in the world, and yet refused to let it hollow him out. She told herself it meant nothing. She had been raised to believe that noticing such things was improper, even dangerous. Enslaved people were meant to be invisible as individuals, reduced to labor and numbers, not personalities. And yet, once she had noticed him, she could not stop. Her attention began to drift toward where he was, even when she did not mean for it to. She found herself lingering by windows, inventing reasons to walk the grounds when she knew he might be nearby. Each time she scolded herself inwardly, convinced curiosity was temporary. Their first words to each other were painfully ordinary. A question about a task, a brief response, nothing more. But the sound of his voice unsettled her. It was low and controlled, with none of the forced cheerfulness she had heard from others. He spoke only when necessary, and when he did, His words were precise. There was intelligence there, carefully hidden, like something precious kept out of reach. Afterward, she replayed the exchange in her mind, embarrassed by how much it had affected her. He, too, noticed her, though for him the danger was far greater. From the moment he recognized her gaze lingering longer than required, he understood how thin the line was between survival and destruction. He had learned long ago how to read people, how to sense moods and intentions. In her, he saw something he had not expected: conflict. She did not look at him with entitlement or indifference, but with uncertainty, as if she were standing at the edge of a thought she did not know how to finish. That uncertainty made her unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. Still, something about her attention felt different from cruelty. Their encounters became more frequent, though never openly sought. A path crossed twice in one day, a moment alone near the stables, a shared silence while work continued around them. They spoke little, but when they did, the air between them felt charged, as though every word carried more weight than it should. Sometimes she asked him questions she had never asked anyone before, simple things about where he was from, what he remembered of life before the plantation. Each time she did, she crossed a boundary she had been taught was never to be crossed. At first, he answered cautiously, giving nothing that could be used against him, but her questions did not come from idle curiosity. They came from a genuine hunch. To understand, and that too was dangerous. He could hear it in her voice, see it in the way she listened. She did not interrupt. She did not rush him. She listened as if his words mattered, as if his memories were real and worth preserving. That alone was enough to make his chest tighten with something he had learned to bury. What grew between them was not romantic at first. It was recognition, two people trapped in different cages, suddenly aware of each other's confinement. She began to see the plantation differently through his presence. The land she had once viewed as peaceful now looked heavy, burdened by suffering she could no longer ignore. Through him, the abstract became personal. The system she had been raised to accept revealed its cruelty not through ideology, but through a human face she could not forget. For him, she represented a contradiction he had never imagined confronting. She was part of the world that owned him, yet she did not fully belong to it. Her kindness was hesitant, restrained by fear and conditioning, but it was real. That made her both a comfort and a threat. He knew that closeness to her could destroy him, yet distance felt increasingly impossible. Each time she appeared, each time their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, growing heavier with every encounter. The danger sharpened the connection. Every shared moment felt stolen, fragile, temporary. They learned to communicate through pauses, glances, unfinished sentences. The things they could not say pressed against their silence, filling it with meaning. When she laughed softly at something he said, it felt like a betrayal of everything she had been taught. When he allowed himself to smile back, it felt like defiance. Slowly, the nature of their bond shifted. It moved from curiosity to reliance. She began to seek his presence not just for conversation, but for grounding. In a world that demanded she play a role at all times, he was the only one with whom she felt momentarily real. With him, she did not have to perform grace or obedience. She could simply exist, uncertain and questioning. That freedom, however brief, became addictive. For him, she became a reminder of what had been taken from him: choice, dignity, and the right to define his own life. And yet, she also represented the possibility of something he had not allowed himself to imagine in years: connection without dominance, acknowledgement without ownership. He hated himself for wanting it. He feared himself for needing it. Still, he could not turn away. Whispers began to circulate, though neither knew exactly when. On plantations, nothing stayed hidden for long. A glance held too long. A path crossed too often. Eyes noticed things long before mouths spoke them aloud. The tension of being watched crept into their interactions, sharpening every moment with fear. They spoke even less now, yet felt closer than ever. The threat of discovery loomed constantly, like a storm waiting just beyond the horizon. It was during this time that the truth became impossible to ignore. What bound them was no longer just understanding or sympathy. It was desire, raw, terrifying, and forbidden. Not just physical desire, but the desire to escape who they were forced to be, to choose even once something for themselves. That desire frightened her more than anything she had ever known. It threatened everything she had been taught to value: reputation, safety, identity. For him, the desire carried an even sharper edge. To be discovered meant torture or death. To run meant a life hunted, uncertain, and brutal, and yet staying meant watching this impossible connection slowly destroy them both. The plantation that had once been merely a place of labor now felt like a trap closing in. Were nights when she lay awake, replaying every interaction, every word, wondering when exactly she had crossed the line. She tried to pray it away, to bury it under duty and routine, but the more she resisted, the stronger it grew. In her heart, something had already shifted. She could no longer unsee him as a man. She could no longer see herself as merely a wife. For him, the internal conflict was relentless. He told himself again and again that hope was a luxury he could not afford, that trust was dangerous, that she would ultimately choose safety over him. And yet, when she appeared, when she spoke his name softly, all those defenses weakened. Against his will, he began to imagine escape, not just from the plantation, but from the life that had been forced upon him since birth. What neither of them yet realized was that this bond, once formed, could not be undone. It was not something that could fade quietly or be corrected with distance. It was a fracture, deep and spreading, in the foundation of everything they knew. The plantation still stood. The routines still continued. To the outside world, nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, two lives had begun moving toward a choice that would erase them both from the world they knew. And the closer they grew, the more inevitable that choice became. By the time she fully understood what had taken hold of her, it was already too large to deny. What she felt could no longer be disguised as sympathy or curiosity, nor could it be smothered beneath prayer or routine. It had sharpened into something fierce and terrifying, something that challenged not just her marriage but the very laws and beliefs that governed her world. In 1847 Louisiana, love was not merely a private emotion, it was a social weapon, a tool used to maintain order. And what she felt now was an act of rebellion, whether she intended it to be or no. She knew the rules as well as anyone. She had been raised on them, shaped by them, protected and imprisoned by them. A white woman was expected to embody purity, obedience and loyalty to her husband. Her body, her name, her future, all belonged to the man she married. Even her thoughts were meant to stay within invisible boundaries. To step outside those limits was to invite scandal, exile, or worse. And yet, the line she had crossed could not be uncrossed. The knowledge settled in her bones with quiet certainty. If discovered, there would be no forgiveness. For him, the danger was absolute. The law did not see him as a man capable of love, only as property guilty of defiance. Any accusation, whether proven or not, could lead to public punishment, meant not just to break him, but to warn others. Torture, mutilation, death. These were not distant threats, but everyday tools of control. He had witnessed them before. He knew exactly what the consequences would be if anyone suspected what he felt, what they shared. And yet, knowing did not make it easier to walk away. Their meetings grew heavier with unspoken fear. Every glance carried the weight of consequence. Every moment alone felt borrowed from a future that might never exist. She began to understand that the world would never allow them to exist together openly. There would be no mercy, no quiet compromise. Society demanded sacrifice, and it would not be hers. If anyone paid the price, it would be him. That realization haunted her, gnawed at her conscience, and forced her to confront a truth she could no longer ignore. To love him was to endanger him. She tried at times to pull away, to shorten their conversations, to avoid the paths where they might meet, to remind herself of her position, her duties, her safety. But the absence only made the connection stronger. Distance did not weaken it, it sharpened it. She found herself restless, distracted, moving through her days like a ghost. The plantation that once felt stifling now felt hostile, a place actively working to erase something she could not let go of. For him, restraint became a daily battle. He measured every word, every movement, knowing how easily suspicion could be stirred. He told himself again and again that survival depended on control, that attachment was dangerous, that he had no right to want anything beyond endurance. But when she appeared, when she looked at him with that mixture of fear and resolve, all his careful defenses faltered. She was no longer simply part of the system that enslaved him. She was someone who saw him, who listened, who treated his existence as meaningful. That recognition was intoxicating and unbearable all at once. What bound them now was not only affection, but shared risk. They were both living on the edge of discovery, and that tension fed something darker and deeper. It transformed every interaction into a silent act of defiance. They spoke more carefully now, choosing words that could pass unnoticed if overheard. But beneath those careful exchanges lay an understanding that needed no language. They were choosing each other in a world that forbade it. At night she lay awake imagining what would happen if the truth came out. She pictured the faces of her husband's peers, the women who smiled politely at her, the men who spoke of honor and morality. She knew exactly how quickly admiration would turn to hatred. She would not be seen as misguided or confused, but as corrupted, dangerous, a stain to be erased. And yet, even that vision could not fully extinguish what she felt. Fear competed with longing, but it did not win. He too imagined discovery, though his visions were far more brutal. He had seen men punished for less, beaten for speaking out of turn, killed for attempting. Escape. To be accused of touching what society considered forbidden would mark him beyond redemption. Still, he could not bring himself to sever the bond completely. The thought of returning to a life emptied of connection felt like a slower kind of death. Between immediate destruction and prolonged erasure, neither choice felt survivable. The contradiction became unbearable. Love, which was supposed to be a source of comfort, had become a constant threat. Every emotion carried danger, every heartbeat felt like a countdown, and yet, within that danger, there was also clarity. For the first time in her life, she understood exactly what she wanted, even if she could not yet admit it aloud. She wanted choice. She wanted truth. She wanted a life not dictated by inheritance and fear. For him, the clarity was even sharper. He had lived his entire life without illusion. He knew freedom was not promised, that survival required constant vigilance. But now, for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future shaped by decision rather than force. That imagination frightened him more than chains ever had. Hope, he knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. They began to speak cautiously about escape, not directly at first, but in fragments. Mentions of places beyond the plantation, stories of others who had run and vanished into swamps or crossed borders under cover of darkness. Each reference felt like a test, a question asked without being spoken. Could such a thing be possible? Could two people so bound by circumstance disappear together? The idea was reckless. She understood that if she left, she would be abandoning everything she had been taught to value: her name, her protection, her place in society. There would be no return, no forgiveness. She would cease to exist in the world she knew. For him, escape meant a lifetime of pursuit, always looking over his shoe. Dare always one step from capture. There was no version of freedom that came without fear, and yet staying felt worse. Staying meant slow suffocation. It meant returning to roles that felt increasingly false, pretending nothing had changed when everything had. It meant allowing the system to dictate the end of something that felt profoundly real. The realizations settled between them with quiet inevitability. The world had left them no safe choices. What made it unbearable was the imbalance of risk. She knew that even if she were punished, her suffering would never equal his. Her whiteness, her former status, would always grant her a measure of protection denied to him. That knowledge filled her with guilt, but also resolve. If there was to be danger, she would not let him face it alone. Loving him meant accepting consequences alongside him, not hiding behind privilege. For him, accepting her resolve was difficult. Trust did not come easily to someone whose life had taught him betrayal as a survival skill. He questioned her intentions, her endurance, her understanding of what lay ahead. He did not want to be the reason she lost everything, even as he could not deny how deeply he wanted her to choose him. Their love was not romanticized by illusions. It was forged in realism, sharpened by fear, tested by reason. As whispers around the plantation grew louder, the pressure intensified, eyes lingered, movements were watched. Innocent actions were suddenly scrutinized. The margin for error shrank until it felt non-existent. The plantation, once merely oppressive, now felt actively hostile, as if it sensed their defiance and was tightening its grip. What bound them now was not just love, but urgency. Time no longer stretched endlessly before them. It pressed down, heavy and relentless. They were running out of space to hesitate. Every day that passed without action in Korea said the chance that the decision would be made for them, violently and publicly. And so, in the shadow of laws designed to crush them, in a society built on control and fear, they stood at the edge of an irreversible choice. To stay was to surrender. To leave was to risk everything. Love had not freed them, it had forced them to confront the truth of their world. And once that truth was seen, it could never be unseen. The night they chose was heavy with heat, the kind that pressed against the skin and made every breath feel deliberate. The plantation settled into darkness the way it always did, with lamps dimmed one by one and voices fading into murmurs before silence took hold. Crickets sang relentlessly, and somewhere beyond the fields, frogs called from the marshes, their rhythms steady and uncaring. To anyone watching from a distance, nothing appeared different. But beneath that familiar stillness, a decision was unfolding that would shatter the order of everything that had come before. She waited until the house surrendered fully to sleep. Her husband's breathing deepened, slow and unbroken, the sound of a man confident that the world would still belong to him by morning. She lay still beside him, eyes open, staring into the darkness, counting the seconds between each breath. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared it might wake him. Every instinct screamed for caution, for delay, for retreat into the safety of routine. But safety had become another word for suffocation. She rose carefully, inch by inch, lifting the covers without sound, placing her feet on the cool floor as if stepping into a different life. She did not take much. No jewels, no dresses, no letters. Everything she left behind would speak louder than anything she carried. A simple cloak, sturdy shoes, her hair tied back tightly, stripped of ornament. In the dim light, she looked at her reflection. Only once. The woman staring back at her felt unfamiliar, raw, stripped of the polish she had worn like armor for years. She did not recognize herself, and for the first time that felt right. Outside, the night wrapped around her like a living thing. The air was thick with scent, damp earth, sugarcane, smoke lingering from earlier fires. She moved along paths she had walked countless times before, now made dangerous by their familiarity. Every shadow looked like a witness, every sound felt amplified. She kept to the edges, where moonlight broke through the trees in pale fragments, guiding her toward the meeting point they had chosen with such care. He was already there when she arrived, standing half-hidden among the trees, his form barely distinguishable from the darkness. He had been waiting longer than planned, listening for any sign that she might not come. When he saw her, a tension he had not realized he was holding loosened slightly in his chest. There was no time for words, no space for doubt. A single look passed between them, heavy with everything they were leaving behind. They moved quickly at first, keeping low, following routes he had memorized through years of labor and observation. He knew which paths were watched, which fences creaked, which dogs were likely to stir. The plantation, once a place of control, now revealed its vulnerabilities under the cover of night. Still, every step carried risk. A snapped twig, a cough, a moment of hesitation, any of it could end them. As they reached the outer edges of the land, the world changed. The manicured order of the plantation gave way to wildness. Thick undergrowth, uneven ground, waterlogged soil that sucked at their boots. The bayou loomed ahead, dark and endless, its surface reflecting broken pieces of moonlight. This was where rules dissolved, where maps lost meaning. It was also where people disappear. Red. They slowed their pace, careful not to leave obvious tracks. The insects grew louder, swarming, biting, relentless. Sweat soaked through her clothes, her breath shallow as fear and adrenaline tangled together. She stumbled once, catching herself on his arm, and for a brief moment they froze, listening. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Another answered. The sound carried through the night like a warning. They waited until the barking faded before moving again, their bodies pressed close, sharing warmth and tension. In that closeness, she felt the reality of what they were doing settle fully into her bones. There was no turning back now, no story she could invent that would explain her absence by morning. She was not just leaving a house or a husband, she was abandoning an identity the world would never allow her to reclaim. As they pushed deeper into the swamp, the ground became treacherous. Mud clung to their boots, threatening to pull them under with each step. Water seeped through the soles, cold and foul-smelling. Branches snagged at their clothes like grasping hands. The darkness felt alive, shifting, watching. He moved ahead of her, clearing the way, whispering directions she followed without question. In this world, he was the guide, the protector, the one who knew how to survive. Time lost its meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, measured only by exhaustion and pain. Her muscles burned, her lungs ached, but she did not stop. She could not afford to. The thought of capture, of being dragged back, of what would happen to him if they were found, pushed her forward when her body begged to rest. Fear sharpened her focus until nothing existed beyond the next step. At some point, the distant sounds of the plantation vanished completely, swallowed by the vastness of the swamp. The silence that replaced them was deeper, heavier, broken only by these splashes of unseen creatures moving through the water. They paused briefly on a patch of firmer ground, both bent forward, hands on knees, breathing hard. In the dim light, she saw his face clearly for the first time that night, set with determination, streaked with sweat and mud, eyes bright with a mixture of terror and resolve. She wanted to speak, to tell him what this meant to her, to put words to the enormity of the choice she had made. But words felt fragile, unnecessary. Everything that mattered had already been said through action. She reached for his hand, squeezing it once, and that small gesture carried more weight than any vow. They moved again before dawn threatened the horizon. Daylight would bring exposure, and exposure would bring death. As they pressed on, she felt the last threads tying her to her old life snap quietly, one by one. The house, the name, the expectations, all of it receded behind her, replaced by a single terrifying truth. From this moment on, survival would depend on trust and endurance alone. Somewhere behind them, the plantation would wake. Her absence would be noticed. Voices would rise. Horses would be saddled, dogs would be set loose with scraps of clothing to scent the trail. The machinery of capture would grind into motion, fueled by outrage and wounded pride. She imagined her husband's face when he realized she was gone, not confused, but furious, not heartbroken, but humiliated. That humiliation would demand blood. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the swamp's cold. She knew then that even if they were never found, the world they had escaped would hunt them in stories, in whispers, in legends meant to warn others against following their path. They would be painted as monsters, fools, sinners, anything but what they truly were, two people who had refused to disappear quietly as the first faint light of dawn began to stain the sky. They reached a stretch of water that marked a turning point. Beyond it lay uncertainty, but also possibility. He hesitated only once before stepping into the water, testing its depth, then motioning for her to follow. The water was shockingly cold, stealing her breath, dragging at her legs as they waded through, every movement slowed and exposed. On the far side, soaked and trembling, they did not stop. There would be no rest yet, no relief, no safety, only distance earned inch by inch. As the sun rose fully behind them, casting pale light over the swamp, the plantation disappeared from view entirely, swallowed by trees and mist. By morning, they were already becoming ghosts. No one would see them leave. No one would witness the courage or the fear or the love that had driven them into the darkness. All that would remain was absence, a missing wife, a vanished enslaved man, and a trail that dissolved into mud and water. History would record the disappearance as a mystery, stripped of its humanity. But in that moment, moving forward into an unknown future with nothing but each other, they were not a mystery. They were alive, and they were free, at least for now. By the time the plantation fully woke, the damage had already been done. The house stirred with its usual rituals, doors opening, footsteps moving down hallways, the clink of dishes. But something felt wrong almost immediately. The bed was cold on one side. Her room was untouched, her belongings still neatly arranged, as if she might return at any moment. There was no note, no explanation, no sign of struggle, just absence. The kind of absence that unsettles the air and makes every sound feel too loud. When the truth settled in, it did so violently. Voices rose, orders were shouted, horses were saddled before the sun had climbed high enough to burn away the mist. Dogs were eyed out, their leashes taut, their noses pressed to the ground. The plantation owner's fury was not the kind that burned hot and quickly. It was cold, controlled, and relentless. This was not only a personal betrayal, it was a public humiliation. In a world where reputation was power, losing a wife to a runaway slave was an insult that demanded correction. Search parties fanned out across the land, tearing through fields, woods, and swamps with methodical cruelty. Men rode hard, scanning for broken branches, footprints, anything that could be turned into a lead. Dogs followed faint scents that twisted and vanished in the waterlogged ground. The bayou swallowed tracks as easily as it swallowed sound. Every hour that passed without success sharpened the anger, transforming it into something darker and more dangerous. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed they had seen movement in the marshes at dawn. Others swore the pair had been caught and quietly killed to avoid scandal. Stories contradicted each other, tangled together and multiplied. The uncertainty made people uneasy. The idea that a white woman could choose to vanish rather than return to her rightful place challenged the fragile order everyone relied upon. It was easier to believe she was dead than to accept that she had escaped willingly. As days turned into weeks, the search widened, then thinned. Exhaustion set in. The swamp resisted every attempt to tame it, offering only insects, sickness, and endless mud in return. Men came back with torn clothes, empty hands, and growing superstitions. Some whispered that the land itself was hiding them. Others muttered that the woman had been cursed long before she ran. Fear crept in where certainty had once lived. Inside the plantation house, silence returned, heavier than before. Her absence filled every room, pressing against the walls, her husband avoided. Her chambers, as if entering them would confirm a failure he refused to accept. When he did step inside, it was not grief that surfaced, but rage at the loss of control. He ordered her name spoken less and less, as though erasing it might restore the balance she had disrupted. Officially, she became a mystery. Unofficially, she became a warning. Mothers spoke her name in hushed tones to their daughters, framing her story as madness, corruption, or moral collapse. Ministers hinted at divine punishment without naming it directly. The message was clear: deviation led to disappearance. And disappearance was worse than death, because it left questions behind. Years passed. The plantation continued to operate, the crops harvested, the profits counted. New faces replaced old ones. The world moved on, as it always does. But the story did not vanish. It changed shape. It slipped into folklore, into whispered conversations and late-night stories told by firelight. Some claimed the couple had survived, building a hidden life deep in the swamps, raising children who learned to walk silently and vanish when strangers approached. Others insisted they were betrayed by someone they trusted, caught at the edge of freedom and destroyed without record. There were those who swore they had seen a woman traveling under another name in distant towns, her accent softened, her past carefully concealed. A woman who never stayed long, who avoided questions, whose eyes carried a depth that hinted at loss and endurance. There were rumors of a man seen beside her, quiet, watchful, always ready to move. None of these stories could be proven. That uncertainty was what kept them alive. Over time, the facts blurred, but the emotion remained. The vanished bride of 1847 became less a person and more a symbol, shaped by whoever told the story. To some, she was a cautionary tale about betrayal and chow. To others, she was a figure of tragic romance, destroyed by forces larger than herself. And to a quiet few, she represented something far more dangerous: choice. Because beneath all the speculation lay a truth that frightened people more than scandal ever could. She had chosen to leave. She had looked at comfort, safety, and social power, and walked away. That act alone unsettled the foundation of a society built on the idea that roles were fixed and obedience was natural. If she could choose differently, what did that mean for everyone else? As decades rolled forward and the Civil War reshaped the nation, her story resurfaced in new ways. Emancipation changed laws, but memory is slower to evolve. Some former enslaved people spoke of the couple with quiet respect, passing down fragments of a tale about love and escape. To them, the story was not scandal, it was resistance. It was proof that the system could be defied, even if only briefly, even at great cost. Historians searched records and found nothing conclusive: no death certificate, no return, no verified sighting. The absence remained complete, defying documentation, and so the mystery endured, suspended between possibility and loss. What became of them in the end is something no one can say with certainty. Perhaps they survived, carving out a fragile existence on the margins of society, always cautious, always aware that freedom came with a price. Perhaps they were caught and erased, their story cut short before it could fully unfold. Or perhaps their fate lies somewhere in between, marked by hardship, sacrifice, and moments of fierce, fleeting joy. What is certain is this: the world they left behind never fully recovered from their absence. A crack had formed in the narrative everyone depended on, and no amount of silence could seal it completely. The plantation stood, but something essential had gone missing from its walls. A truth had escaped into the wild beyond reach. Today, when the story is told, it still carries that power. It forces listeners to sit with uncertainty, to confront uncomfortable questions about love, freedom, and the courage it takes to choose both when the world forbids them. The vanished bride of 1847 is not remembered because her fate is known, but because it is not. She exists in the space where history fails to provide neat answers, and in that space she lives on, not as a footnote, not as a scandal, but as a reminder that even in the darkest systems there are those who refuse to disappear quietly.